China's two sessions wraps up in Beijing. What were some of the key topics? And what about plans for China's future development? Hello, I'm Einar, and this is The Heat. China's top political leaders, lawmakers and advisors from across the country have wrapped up Beijing's major political gathering known as the Two Sessions. The National People's Congress, the NPC, concluded its annual session on Thursday, and Chinese Premier Li Keqiang addressed a range of important issues at a major press conference. Meanwhile, we are learning more about a meeting expected to take place in Alaska next week between Chinese and U.S. officials. We begin with this report from Beijing.
赞成2895票，弃权1票。
With 2,895 deputies voting yes, 0 against, and 1 abstention, the Chinese legislature adopted the decision to improve the electoral system of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. The decision comes after deliberations and amendments over the past week.
香港
The purpose of the decision is clear. It is to adhere to and improve the systemic structure of one country, two systems, uphold the principle of patriots administering Hong Kong, and ensure steady implementation of one country, two systems.
2021 marks the beginning of a new 5-year development plan for the country. Lawmakers also gave the go-ahead for the details of the 14th 5-year plan and long-term development goals by 2035. The NPC also approved the government work report, which set China's GDP growth target at about 6% this year. Premier Li said the target took into consideration of global uncertainties while allowing possibilities of a robust recovery.
We must avoid wide swings in economic performance because that will disrupt market expectations. Growth that is too fast will not be steady. A steady pace is needed for sustained development. So what we hope for such a big economy as China's is sustained and sound long-term growth.
On China-U.S. relations, Premier Li said that disagreements and differences are unavoidable, but the two countries share common interests. He said both sides should respect each other's core interests and major concerns, and focus on cooperation rather than confrontation. Experts say this year's two sessions carries extra weight because through the 14th 5-year plan, it is setting the tone for the country's next stage of development. And given complex geopolitics and an unpredictable international environment, China is surging ahead with concrete goals. And it's this kind of certainty that will hopefully give the world a boost as well. Soochow, CGTN, at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing.
Okay, let's bring in our panel now to discuss all of this. Joining me now from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is an international relations expert and is also chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a political and economic affairs commentator. Joining us here in Washington is James Moore. He is the CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society, and he's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development. Also with us is Sourabh Gupta. He is Resident Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us. Victor Gao, let me start with you, and let me start with one of the key issues at this year's two sessions meetings. The Chinese legislature has now decided to improve the electoral system in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. How significant is this, and what would it mean for Hong Kong?
Well, and this is a very significant, important landmark decision for the Hong Kong SAR. On the other hand, this decision just speaks the plain truth. Why? Because every country, every jurisdiction will not allow anyone who is not a patriot, who is not loyal to the jurisdiction to serve the interest of its people, because otherwise it will be just the opposite. It is kind of considered as against the fundamental interests of the people, or even treason. So I think this decision, while very important as a landmark decision, is also speaking plain truth. And I think those countries which are now pointing an accusing finger at this legislation should reflect their own legislation and their own circumstances to see whether they would elect anyone to be the president or the prime minister of that country or that jurisdiction who is not a patriot. This decision, this legislation will contribute significantly to making sure that the election in Hong Kong going forward will go more smoothly.
Okay, Einar Tangen, I want to move on to another big story that broke this week, and that is the planned meeting between high-ranking officials from the United States and from China. That's slated to take place in Alaska next week. What are your expectations of this meeting? Could this be the start of rebuilding this relationship?
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, they're not discussing a lot what's going to be specifically on that agenda. But, you know, talk is hopeful. And we're talking about career diplomats here, although both of them have been very, very tough on China. They have, at least politically, towed the line that is pretty much bipartisan in Washington, that China somehow is the problem. They haven't been able to enunciate or add a lot of detail to that. They just say, you know, China this, China that. But as I said, talk is the only way forward. And at this point, it's very positive. Note that the U.S. did not want to meet in China. They insisted on some, quote, Alaska is somehow nearby. They will be coming from a series of meetings with the Quad, etc. It'll be interesting to see what kind of tone they take and what is released publicly.
James Moore, what is your view on this? China is describing this meeting as high-level strategic dialogue. In fact, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has called for the two countries to focus on common ground. And the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has also said that managing the U.S.-China relationship will be, in his words, the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. So, James, what do you think will come out of this?
Well, first of all, most importantly, I think sitting down and being able to gauge one another as to the future relations of our two countries is going to be absolutely critical. I think it's a mistake to not realize that things are not necessarily going to get much better than they were under President Trump, despite the fact that both President Trump and President Biden are very, very different kinds of individuals. In the case of President Trump, when he invited President Xi to Mar-a-Lago, he really wanted to take stock of the Chinese president. Given the background of President Trump, he was not that familiar with all the details about China, but given his real estate background, wanted very much to take the measure of the man and to be able to really begin to formulate policy based on that first meeting. In the case of President Biden, we forget too often that he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate for quite a few years and on that committee for even longer. And so I think at this point, they certainly have some fundamental understandings of what they believe China is all about. But this first meeting is going to allow them to really dig in and figure out what the future is going to look like under a Biden administration.
James, as you say, there may not be many changes as far as policy is concerned, but we can expect a change at least in tone, in language, and approach to this as well?
No question about it, and I think it's very helpful. The most recent statistics regarding China actually importing quite a few agricultural products, particularly soybeans, I think is very helpful in the process and stands as a reminder that we're able to work with one another to deal with some incredible issues. And one of those issues is, of course, climate change. And the tone so far between both governments has been very positive in that regard. But there are going to be other thorny issues that they're going to have to deal with. But this first meeting, I think, is just going to be able to sit across the table to raise what those issues are and to be able to go away back to Beijing and to Washington, trying to determine exactly what the next few years are going to look like.
Sourabh Gupta, after all the vitriol of the Donald Trump era and the trade war that Donald Trump directed at the Chinese, do you think the two sides are going to be able to get past this and make some kind of progress?
No, I actually do think that they will be able to make some kind of progress and to some extent get past what happened during those 4 years, particularly during those last two years. Obviously, the important measures this year should be more focused towards global public health and climate change, and those topics are teed up. But fundamentally, it is about reform of China's domestic economy, particularly its industrial subsidies regime and its SOE regime. We have seen China make those commitments in the context of the comprehensive agreement on investment with the European Union. These were discussed in phase 2. These are huge irritants, but China has moved considerably in the context of phase 1 on issues like coerced technology transfer and intellectual property rights. And I actually see that it's very much foreseeable that the commitments that China has made to the U.S., to Europe, China will make to U.S. in the context of a redefined phase 2 agreement. And that will really tamp down a lot of tensions, because fundamentally we have strategic tensions, but we have these economic tensions also. And these economic tensions are certainly manageable to a very considerable extent, but with continuing reform at the Chinese end, though.
Victor Gao, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he is expected to be at that meeting in Alaska. He has been talking recently about China-U.S. relations. This is somewhat what he said recently. Let's listen.
What matters most is to manage the differences and disagreements effectively through candid communication to prevent strategic miscalculation and avoid conflict and confrontation.
Victor, there are so many issues that concern both sides. Yeah, it's not just about climate change and trade, it's also security concerns as well. And as Einar Tangen just pointed out a moment ago, the U.S. delegation will be meeting the Chinese delegation after they hold talks with their Quad partners. They'll be holding talks with officials in South Korea as well as in Japan. So what do you think this is about?
Well, first of all, please allow me to congratulate this upcoming meeting between the Chinese side and the American side. This is a very important meeting. This really bodes well, in my best judgment, for a better and more constructive relations between China and the United States. The fact that the talk is happening is much, much better than the estranged relations which have lasted for 4 years under Trump. And it bodes well for both China and the United States, and for the Chinese top leader, as well as for Joe Biden on the American side, for their eagerness to explore a way to put a handle on this very complicated situation between China and the United States. I do believe that they have more in common ground to talk about than all the differences that separate them. Why? Because there are so many challenges, both in China as well as in the United States, and on the global stage. And China and the United States are not destined to be enemies against each other. China has no desire to upseat the United States from the global stage, and China will be very happy to live together with the United States in a world which is becoming more and more diversified, and multilateralism will be more in the place. So I think this is a good opportunity for the two countries to size up each other, to really talk to each other. And both Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi are not strangers to their counterparts in the United States, Mr. Blinken and Mr. Sullivan. They know China well, they know each other well, and I'm sure they can find a common dialogue and common language to figure out what's the best way to prevent the deterioration of the bilateral relations, what's the best way to restore certain mutual trust to a certain extent, to start with at least, and how to manage those relations for the fundamental real interest of the American people on the one hand, and also for the Chinese people. These two nations can find a way to get along, and that's my best hope. And I hope this hope is also shared by mankind as a whole.
Okay, well, those meetings take place next week in Alaska. We shall see what happens. I now want to get back to the two sessions meetings, which have just wrapped up in Beijing. Lawmakers have approved the outlines of the next 5-year plan. What major developments can we expect from China over the next 5 years?
Well, I mean, I think you have to kind of step back a little bit and just see what has happened lately in terms of context. First off, China has been able to navigate a very, very difficult year. To date, they have COVID-19 under control. They've been able to grow their economy. And a lot of that confidence is projected in this. They're very clearly a series of red lines, especially about territorial issues, and then open doors, especially on trade, that were shown internationally. Internally, you see things moving more towards social concerns, aging, population, access to health care, the urban-rural divide, what they call the, and now moving from poverty alleviation directly into what they call rural revitalization. So, you know, it's interesting. China is becoming increasingly middle class, and that's what I took away from the main body of this. There was so much talk about all of the issues affecting the elderly, the young, etc., and a very quiet confidence going forward that China will continue on its path. This is a contrary notion to this, you know, what my American colleague has said about managing China. China is not to be managed. It is not a subservient country. It is a sovereign country that has done very well for the last 40 years. I think it behooves us in the U.S. to understand that we have not achieved what we've wanted over the last 40 years, with a middle class that is deteriorating in terms of its buying power, also now beset with a lot of international issues. In terms of my colleague, Mr. Gupta, I would say it's the exact opposite. China is moving forward with the U.S. on international issues, COVID-19, vaccine distribution. It has to figure out a way of revitalizing the world economy. I think it's the domestic concerns which are the real irritants as America prepares for the reality that China will not be a subservient, but actually, hopefully, a partner as they go forward.
Sourabh, very quickly, your thoughts on what Einar just told us?
China, yes, there are domestic concerns all around. There's no question about that. But China will be forced to make many of these, to move forward very quickly on things like state-owned enterprises and industrial subsidies, because it will be forced by both its European partners and its American partners in this regard. And frankly, the way around U.S. unilateral export controls is actually to have the market play a greater role in China and to force and to incentivize others to come to China and produce, and thereby and thereafter design American parts and components out. So it's not by beseeching and asking U.S. to remove those export controls, incentivizing or almost coercing Americans to remove those controls, but that first requires China to become more pro-market in many of its industrial subsidies and industrial policy disciplines.
James, as we heard at the beginning of the program from our reporter, China has set a GDP target of just over 6% for 2021. Now, you have worked and have been involved in trade issues at the highest levels of the U.S. government. How do you think that target will be seen in the United States, and perhaps what it will deliver to the world economy?
Well, right now the United States is beginning to show that it's coming out of the COVID pandemic period, and that the economy, while it's not in an optimal situation, is indeed growing. And so I think that the United States and China clearly are going to be seen at the top of the scale when it comes to the entire global economy. But I think as far as China is concerned, the United States is going to be very concerned not just about working with it on climate change, on trade, on other such things, but very concerned about the way technology is going to be played in China in the coming years, dealing with artificial intelligence, dealing with cybersecurity. I think that there is genuine concern on the part of Washington that it keeps its eyes open as to what is transpiring in Beijing, so that it can respond. And I'm not talking about in any kind of a military-like approach, rather trying to be able to see it as a serious competitor. And that is going to certainly dictate exactly how the United States is going to proceed.
Victor, we've heard this very often. Technology is a key issue for both sides, for both the United States and for China. The United States concerned about Chinese developments in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity as well, cyber development as well, as James just told us. What's the view from China?
Well, technology and innovation are very important for China, increasingly so in the years to come. And the U.S. concerned about the protection of the intellectual property rights can be shared by the Chinese side. Why? Because China is fast becoming a leading country in terms of coming up with new patents, new copyrights, and all kinds of intellectual property rights, etc. So please believe me that it is in China's own interest to provide as much protection to the intellectual property rights as it is for the United States. That's taken for granted. Now, on the other hand, it is wrong to use intellectual property rights as an excuse to attack another country, as if that country's development is based on so-called stealing intellectual property rights from other countries, etc. No, China's economic development for the past 42 years is very much based on the hardworking and sacrifices and making efforts of all kinds in all directions, and that could be the only explanation of the rapid and robust economic transformation of China. Depending on technology and innovation will be the accelerator of China's economic development. And it is today the situation that there are more technological breakthroughs out of China, which to a certain extent the United States doesn't even have. So I think it is time for China and the United States to really compare notes with each other, to learn from each other, and to make sure that both countries can benefit from sharing rather than, for example, withholding my technology from the other side and becoming a vicious circle going forward.
James, let me get your thoughts on that very quickly. Is the future relationship between these two countries still going to be steeped in suspicion and distrust, or is that going to change?
Nope, it's going to stay that way. I think it is a fool's errand to say that there is smooth sailing ahead over the next 4 years. I think it's going to take an awful lot of hard work. One of the interesting things for the United States is that having watched China perform the way that it has, that it is creating somewhat more of a capitalist industrial policy approach to the way it is going to conduct its business that will have an impact not only on the relationship with China, but also around the world. I think this is a very difficult period. To be able to somehow characterize this as a wonderful opportunity and that things will be just terrific, I think belies the real gravity of where the United States believes its relationship is at this particular moment with China.
Sourabh, I want to move the focus a little bit away from the United States right now. And as I said, China has set a target of just over 6% GDP growth for 2021. How will this impact economies in the region, in Asia?
Obviously, the faster China grows, the better it is for economies in the region, because China also is an export market. But I think even more important than just its growth rate, I think, is the dual circulation philosophy, because the dual circulation philosophy is about really building up the consumptive power of the Chinese economy, not just having growth led by investment and exports, but actually having domestic consumption-led growth and advanced services, advanced manufacturing and services-led growth. And this will suck in a lot of imports. And this is not just from Asia. The Belt and Road is a perfect example for where dual circulation can work. Ideally, it's about Chinese investments going to these countries, say in Africa, firing up the economic engine out there, leading to exports out of a given African country, and China's domestic consumption being that motor which is helping prosperity, not just at home, but also sucking in imports. So I think obviously more growth in China and more consumption-led growth in China is going to be very beneficial for the world and certainly for Asia.
Einar, Tangen, one of the other things that Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about recently is China's continuing commitment to globalization. Let's listen to what he had to say.
我们不应该退回到保守主义
The answer is not to retreat into protectionism, isolation, or decoupling, but to work together to make globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial for all.
Do you think, Einar, that the United States is going to move past the era of protectionism, move past the Donald Trump philosophy of America first, and embrace multilateralism and globalization?
On one sense, yes. I mean, Biden has made it very clear that he intends to kind of get a group of like-minded countries together. It seems to kind of focus around what I call the Anglosphere, you know, the Five Eyes, the English-speaking world. But I don't know if that's necessarily real multilateralism. In essence, Donald Trump tried to, you know, to be the bully on the playground and push not only China but everyone else around. That didn't work. I think Biden says, well, I still have the same goals. I want the U.S. to maintain U.S. hegemony politically, economically, and militarily. But the way I'm going to do it is get my friends and we'll form a little gang, and that way we can, quote, manage China. I seriously disagree with my colleague, Dr. Gupta, in the sense that China is not going to be forced. If there's anything that the world can learn from this last year and this last two sessions, is that China has a very clear idea of how it can do business with the rest of the world on an equal footing. It is not about beseeching. It is not about being forced. And I think it's time to put those ideas aside. And even if you have different goals, aims, and strategies, systems, it's, you know, the reality is these two have to live together.
Victor, I've just got about a minute left. What do you see as some of China's biggest challenges in the year ahead? You know, we've got a middle-income group in China now, which numbers just over 400 million people. And how are efforts to address widespread inequality in the country going to be addressed?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. Given the brevity of time, let me be very brief. I think China faces two major issues. One is maintaining stability and maintaining growth and development at home, and the other is to maintain peace in the world. Now, this means that China needs to be very focused on continuing the reform and opening up to the outside world to make sure that domestic development will proceed steadily without major disruptions, and also maintaining good relations with all the countries, especially with the United States. Keeping peace is the crucial thing for our time. Thank you.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for another edition of The Heat. Thanks for watching, and join us again the next time.